Thank you very much, Catherine, and warm welcome to the next in a series of cloud computing sessions that we're running over the lunchtime. This particular one is on organisational cloud considerations. There's a very wide scope of topics that we could cover in this particular area, but we're looking predominantly at the networking related infrastructure aspects in relation to Janet's remit in this area. I'm Matthew Cook, as Catherine introduced me. I work for Loughborough University and the head of Network Infrastructure and Telephony there. I've worked there for around 13 years now in a number of different roles, and recently, since 2008, we've been playing an active role in the deployment of cloud computing infrastructure at the university, and it's that I'm going to be covering off this afternoon. As Catherine mentioned, there'll be plenty of time at the very end of the session for questions. Also, as we go through, we have some interactive polls to see how we can tailor this session to your requirements. I'm also a Janet contracted trainer, and will mention a bit about the new courses that we're developing at the end of the session. I'm also a member of the Janet Brokerage Advisory Board. There's a whole raft of different considerations that organisations within the academic sector need to consider when looking at cloud computing. As you can see from the number on the screen in front of you, there's far more that we could possibly cover in a lunchtime's webinar session. Some of the things that we've got there, things like the US Patriot Act, the data protection, there's experts within the sector in those areas. And we're going to provide some links at the end, for example, to Andrew Cormack's blog. His specialism in data protection. Also, some of you may be going to the cloud computing sessions on Thursday in London. People like Christine Sexton from University of Sheffield will be talking about US Patriot Act. Also, some of these presentations will be at Networkshop as well. So what we're really focusing on here is infrastructure readiness, making sure that the equipment at your site is ready and suitable for some of the cloud computing opportunities that are coming up for yourselves. So we start off with a poll. Quite interesting to see how many of you have adopted cloud services so far at your organisation and at what stage that you're in. So you should see a poll now in front of you on the screen. If you can have a look and click on there to see where you are in terms of the adoption of cloud services. I'll give you a little while to have a think because there's lots of bits to read, and then we'll publish the results to see where we are. Okay, so if I display the results, you'll still be able to click on the screen. We seem to have a majority of people that have a few outsourced pieces of software and service. That seems to be the majority there. This is where we initially started from. This is where it's like a journey, cloud computing, starting at that stage. We'll talk about the next steps that people could take. Also interested to see there's 8 organisations on the session today that have already deployed Google Email, Google Apps, or Microsoft Live at Edu. And there isn't anybody so far that's gone further and looked at infrastructure as a service or deploying a cooperative or hybrid cloud. So some of the information later in the session might be interesting for your planning around that activity. Also, for those of you waiting for further information and advice, some of the interactive components of the presentation later on will look at those aspects. We'll be asking what information and advice are you seeking from the Janet community and from the Janet brokerage. So thank you very much for that poll. So in terms of clouds, most people think of cloud computing as one thing or another, but cloud computing could be something completely different. At the 2011 UCISA Cloud Computing Seminar, each presenter that we had throughout the day started off their session by providing a completely different definition of cloud computing. So I want to give you a different perspective. Not all clouds are created equally. Cloud computing really has some basic rules that you have to follow, but otherwise you can mold cloud computing into your own specific requirements. Just as with a firewall, that's a technical implementation of your security policy. Cloud computing could simply be a method of implementing business and infrastructure architecture requirements at your site. So you can make cloud computing fit the mold that you require it to be at your organisation. And we're going to provide some examples of this as we go further along. So many of you said that you're starting out with outsourced software and services. That was where you were looking at cloud computing to start with. Example that we've got here from for ourselves at Loughborough, our service desk software is an outsourced provision. And in terms of the cloud provision for that software, there's one data store, and that data store's at their data center at their head office. We know where that data is. We could go along to their office. We could go into their data server location. We could point at where that data store is. So in terms of cloud computing definitions, that may not fit in to most people's definition of cloud computing. But in terms of what we want from a business requirement, that fits that ideal scenario. We move further along to software as a service. Our example, student Google email and applications. There's a number of different data stores where your data, the students' emails, their documents that they've authored through Google Apps could be stored at. You don't know where that data is between those two data stores. It's hopefully at one of those locations. That starts to fit in towards the more traditional descriptions of cloud computing in the software as a service model. Moving on to the next stage, the next type, is managed infrastructure as a service. Things like the Amazon EC compute facilities, where there is multiple data store locations, multiple compute facilities, and you're uploading a virtual machine to that environment for that computing facility. The final thing we're going to cover off today is looking at a cooperative or hybrid cloud, where you're actively working with the architecture of that cloud. You're actively developing the way that system is going to operate. And this particular example we'll come back to several times through this presentation in terms of a container with your VLE, your virtual learning environment, one of the key business requirements for most academic sites, something that you want to make sure is both resilient and highly available. So something that we've been looking at cloud provision in that area. So we'll come back to that as a recurring theme throughout the presentation. You may not even know that you're using cloud computing. With the consumerization of IT, a lot of the services used by the people in your organization may be cloud computing. Cloud provider, information security, data protection, all these assurances are continually cited as critical aspects of that decision-making process, whether you're going to go with Google Apps, whether you're going to go with Live at Edu, whether you're going to invest in infrastructure as a service. These are particular items that people keep coming back to. One of the things that we may neglect to fully investigate is all of the terms and conditions of this, or whether people are actually using some of these services already. Talking to the research community, we found individual researchers at sites are already using some of the Amazon EC compute facilities. So one of the questions to pose is how many members of your organization are already using things like Dropbox, GoToMyPC, iCloud. In this example, Siri on the iPhone, all of your questions that you pose to Siri are actually processed in the cloud or one of Apple's data centers. Do you offer any advice out to your members of your organization? And have you read the terms and conditions? For example, you cannot use iTunes on your iPhone to develop weapons of mass destruction. What other examples are in your terms and conditions in those agreements? There's been a lot of work going on in this area. University of Cambridge have released the terms and conditions of agreement they have with Google, the community that was presented at Networkshop last year. And also in the cloud computing seminar that we ran last week with Janet UK, there were some questions there asking for advice from the brokerage on a shared approach to terms and conditions, contractual obligations, rather than organisations like ourselves who went out to engage with legal advice that's quite costly when entering to these negotiations. Cloud computing is a bit like a set of stepping stones along our roadmap, starting out with outsourced software, small packages, moving through to software as a service, and getting assured with the level of cloud computing support in that area before making those steps in terms of your own infrastructure. When you're looking at infrastructure as a service, managed and cooperative clouds, some of the requirements of your own site can be fairly complex. That's why these tend to be a later step that people have moved on to. Once the business has some assurance, once the business has some appreciation of what cloud computing can present, that's when we can start to look at the challenges that these later options reveal. In terms of an organisational consideration, these are the services that we currently have as cloud provided services at Loughborough University. So we have a number of services that authenticate through an IDP, identity provider. We use this for seamless single sign-on integration with all of our systems on our campus. We provide student email and applications through Google. We have a shim on top of our library OPAC called Catalog Plus. This is providing very popular with students because of the metadata searching facilities that it offers. That's available again through a cloud-based service. Our service desk software that I mentioned right at the very beginning. All of these cloud-based services require authentication through the IDP before access can be given. We have some services that are predominantly in the outsourced section. We're working with the iTrent company, quite a popular HR system for the academic community, and also WPM Web Page Marketing, who take the majority of the online payments again for the UK academic sector. One of the things that we have done, deployed in the last 6 to 8 months, is a cooperative cloud, a hybrid cloud, where we have replicated compute and storage at both the university campus and out with our partner. And this is where we start to talk about having that mobility function where you can take resources that are running on your university campus and run those resources into the cloud. And we're looking at that seamless migration of the services between one location and the other. Some of the examples that we've given in this particular container that we're looking at would be a group of systems that will provide our virtual learning environment. If we had some downtime at the university, we could migrate the virtual learning environment out to the cloud. Also, that sets us up for the future. So should a business decision be made that cloud computing resource is cheaper than running these systems on our internal, we're ready to go. We've already have that proven, the infrastructure's in place, the container, the group of systems are already mobilized in that cloud infrastructure. We're ready to then move that around. It may be in 12 to 18 months' time that we could have competitive cloud provision through the Janet brokerage, and then we're ready to move that container where the compute and the storage is cheapest. A bit like what's happening in America at the moment, where you have such a breadth across the country that electricity is cheaper in different states. So people are moving their data center, their compute to where the electricity is cheapest. So we're making sure that our business is ready to embrace cloud computing now by making these steps with the cooperative cloud. One of the important considerations is how to get your data into the cloud in the first place. The old-fashioned way, the way or method that still happens, even Amazon EC Compute has this method of posting your hard drive of data to upload that to the Amazon facility. In our case, if we were to move the entire undergraduate population's worth of email into the cloud, we had two choices really. The old-fashioned way, which was to physically post or send the data on a truck down to the data center facility, or via the Janet network. And that's one of the unique advantages that we have in the community. The speed and the resilience of the Janet network enables the majority of these cloud computing concepts to be realized. And in this particular sense, we were able to move 16,000 students worth of email content to Google email apps facilities at that particular time over one weekend. The bottleneck in this particular case was Google's peering rather than anything on the Janet network. We could have done it a lot sooner, but their peering at the time was fairly slow. So one of the examples where Janet's an enabler for cloud computing adoption. One of the other important considerations is resiliency and diversity. If you're providing lots of your services wholly in the cloud, or you're migrating services to your cloud, it's important to make sure that you have that resilience and diversity of your internet connection. So on the left side of the slide in front of you, we've been very careful to architect at Loughborough a resilient and diverse infrastructure to support cloud computing. As we're embracing more and more the concepts, we're putting more and more services within there, we need to make sure that we've got that provision. We'll look at some of the traffic trends as we go through later on, but in terms of having a resilient connection to the Janet network, a resilient core and border through your infrastructure, at all these stages, looking for areas to ensure that there's resilience within that infrastructure. Also, as well as the hardware, the physical box at your site, we need to also look at the fibre provision. So on the right-hand side of the diagram in front of you, we worked very closely with our regional network operator to look at where the fibres that provide our internet connection actually go. So in this particular sense, what you'll be able to see is down here at Loughborough University, we have the A512 that goes to the motorway, and along that road, the fibres for both of our resilient connections and in fact the main EMAN Janet to London fibre all follow the same duct path along the road. And alongside that road happens to be a large BP garage as well. So if we had a disaster, for example, there was an explosion at the BP garage that damaged those fibres, that would be the university cut off from the network infrastructure. Also, the primary link out of the MMAN regional network down to London being lost in that disaster scenario. So this is one of the areas where we applied for the funding to provide a resilient link that takes a diverse path out of Loughborough through to Nottingham. So in this scenario, we could take that diverse path and the diverse route that Janet provides up to Leeds from that area. So it's important to consider not just the logical networking entities, but also your physical topology as well in that sense. And it's not just network infrastructure, it's also physical, it's M&E, mechanical and electrical. So what you're seeing in front of you, this is the physical location for Loughborough's side of the hybrid cloud. The cooperative cloud that we deployed is located in this particular room. We have two of these on our campus. The campus is fairly large, it's 437 acres, and this particular location is a mile apart from the other location that we have for our cooperative cloud on the campus. We also then have the third site across out in Slough. So this particular area, we've got resiliency in terms of power. There's a different substation that provides the power for this particular facility to the one that's on the main part of our campus. Different chillers, all the M&E infrastructure has been provided in terms of resilience as well. So it's a conversation that's business-wide. It was pointed out in the Q&A at the last cloud computing session that we had that it's important that it's a business driver, it's a business decision to go for cloud computing. It does affect all areas of your business, from your facilities management, your estates, people through to IT at the other side as well. And this is just one example why it's a whole business decision. One of the questions that we get asked quite frequently is, what's the bandwidth requirement? So on the graphs in front of you, the scale for the left-hand graph, the Google Email Apps graph, is 100 megabits on the left-hand scale. The traffic for the cooperative cloud, the scale is 20 megabits a second on that scale, just to give you an idea. When you think about migrating student or indeed staff traffic to Google Email Apps, what you have to remember is that if you're uploading a document to distribute among many of your peers, so students working on a collaborative project, they send a document via email to several people, rather than that traffic staying within your organisation, that upload and the multiple downloads are being traversing your Janet connection. External connectivity is required. So this is one of the things that we saw when we first started migrating our students. Typically on average, through the start of term, we're seeing a continual 36 megabits a second traffic attributed purely to Google Email. This started to grow as we rolled out the applications facilities, and as more and more students started to realise the benefit of this particular facility, that grew as well. For example, at the very beginning of term, students weren't using the calendar facilities. Now they're embracing that, and the university itself is integrating the timetable system directly into the student calendars. So as more of these facilities are being used, the upload of student projects, for example, a lot of the collaborative features of Google Apps, then we started to see the traffic increase as it is. And we're seeing peaks at around 100 megabits a second on some days of the month, as you can see below, content coming back down from Google. You'll see, as this is a graph for January 2012, you can see as the students started to return early in the year, that's when we started to see the increase in traffic. In terms of our cooperative cloud, for the systems that we can run in both Loughborough Cloud and the one that we've got down in Slough, you'll see that the systems that we started to migrate, we're starting to steadily grow, specifically around the middle of the graph. This is as we migrate more and more systems, we allow them to be running in both locations. What the traffic here is showing is the content that's being replicated between the storage systems at both sites. The lower graph, the one that's below the line, is a small background activity really for management. It's about 1 megabit per second of traffic, but it's storage replication that you're seeing at the top there. So these particular requirements will obviously scale with the size of the organisation, which should in turn then scale with the size of people's Janet connections. So this is something where we've again realised the benefit that the Janet connection brings to our organisation. So this slide at first glance may look a bit complicated, but here's some of the concepts that need to be discussed really in terms of providing that cooperative cloud, that ability to migrate to live running services. So in the bottom right of the slide, there is a laptop here, and the person on that laptop wants to access the organisational VLE, the virtual learning environment. In terms of that at the moment, I've put in a web server here that's running that virtual learning environment. I've used private IP addressing just for clarity in the diagram. It's not specific to this example. On this particular server here running the virtual learning environment, we'd want to be able to move this server between different storage facilities, different compute resources on the university campus. If you're a site that's embraced virtualization, a site that's using VMware, for example, that would allow you to provide that vMotion ability between the two locations. And this is where the layer 2 adjacency concept comes into. As you'll see at the bottom, this machine has a single IP address. Wherever that machine is located on that campus network, it needs to be on the same net block so we can move that around. The DNS is pointing at that specific IP address, so the person at the laptop can access the virtual learning environment. Virtual learning environment will probably need additional resources. It'll authenticate users, which may be linked to your Active Directory system. It may require a database, and I'll put a database example up here, for example, on this particular system. So that builds a set of resources that's required to run your VLE. When you start to look at migrating those systems into the cloud, if it's a one-way operation and you're only going to run your VLE from the cloud and not from the university campus, then that can be achieved fairly simply by moving that virtual machine, by changing its IP address, and in example up at the top right-hand corner, this particular system here, we can run our VLE from the cloud with a different IP address. We've changed the DNS to address that. The difficulty comes if we want to have that mobility, if we want our VLE to be agile and it can move between the university campus, that specific cloud provider, or maybe a multiple cloud providers, depending on who's cheapest to provide that provision. This is where things get a little bit more to address that. The difficulty comes if we want to have that mobility, if we want our VLE to be agile and it can move between the university campus, that specific cloud provider, or maybe a multiple cloud providers, depending on who's cheapest to provide that provision. This is where things get a little bit more complex. So if we have a look at the routing table coming in to this particular example, across the internet, these particular sets of routes are advertised for the Janet network, and then particular routes will be enabled on different parts of the network. So for our cloud service provider, I will just fill in this box here to add some additional details. So we want to make sure that there's some routing to allow traffic across to our service provider. and I'll click out. So you should see some IP addresses in that box there. And that means that we'll be able to redirect some traffic across to the cloud service provider. What we want to achieve is to be able to move that VLA freely between any of the cloud service providers. And one of the ways that you can achieve that, which is what we've done at Loughborough, is to use a small discrete net block and move the actual net block and its routing between the different providers. I will explain a little bit more about that as we go through and talk about our cooperative cloud. So we've got a poll for the next slide about infrastructure readiness. So what we're looking to see is how you feel that your infrastructure is ready. What areas are you looking to achieve? How confident are you that your infrastructure is ready? So have a look down at some of those statements there and see which ones you think is most appropriate to yourselves. There's a few people clicking away at the moment. We're starting to see some results come in. A lot of people are confident in terms of software as a service like student email. For example, if I enable you to see the results as the final people make their selections. So it's a huge spread really among the people participating today, from people who are confident for the software as a service, email provision, people who are starting that investigation process at the moment, also people that have got some concerns about bandwidth, resilience and diversity. I think the resilience and diversity one is quite key. Recently, UCISA did an activity with Janet UK looking at resilience and diversity, so I think that message is being echoed quite succinctly through the community. And some people at the bottom looking about how they'd actually design that cloud architecture. Well, we sat down as part of our ODU tender to look at cloud computing providers and infrastructure updates. That was a large part of what we were asking the potential suppliers. How do we design this cloud architecture? How do we future-proof it? How do we ensure that we build in the exit issues so we can move from different provisions as they become attractive? So thank you very much for your input on that poll there. So we wanted to put this into practice. Once we'd signed off the large part of our storage and compute facilities, the next phase of signing off our cooperative cloud was to actually do this in practice. Now on the right hand side of the screen in front of you, you won't be able to read the details, but you have a trace route from an office computer at Loughborough University to the server providing this web service, or the VLE. And you should be able to see just through the size of the text, there's 3 hops on that particular trace route. It goes out of that system and onto our virtualized environment locally at Loughborough. We then decided that we would use this as a way of testing the migration of that container. So through a set of scripts, we automated the migration of the container, and on the left-hand side, that is a trace route from the same computer to the VLE once we migrated the container across from Loughborough to our partner in Slough using the Janet network. So having that VLE container, or the mobility container, instantiated at Slough in that particular example. So you can see the number of the hops. There's 11 hops on the left-hand side compared to 3 on the right-hand side. With that particular example, we were able to move the compute and storage to Slough and back again within an hour and a half's process. We'll explain a little bit about how we tried to speed that up. But that will allow you to move essential services out of your organisation to a cloud provider in terms of business continuity. If you have planned outages, you may have systems that you're running in parallel, so that if you did have an unplanned outage, that data will automatically be replicated at the cloud provider as well. In terms of the steps, we had 22 steps that were configured. The vast majority of them were automated. However, what this slide is indicating really is a problem of routing. What we needed to do to automate the rest of the manual steps is to provide a peering with BGP directly between ourselves and Janet. So one of the stages that we were looking at is to automate that routing decision. Back at one of the original diagrams where I put in the routing, what we want to do is we want to rewrite the routing tables so that we can move the ownership of that particular network between Loughborough and our cooperative cloud. So the Loughborough provision being over here and the cooperative cloud provision being over here. So what we're doing at the moment is the manual steps is the injection of that routed to OSPF. And what we will be doing in the future is having a direct peering with Janet so we can advertise this route via BGP. So that's some of the technical areas that we won't go into any more technical detail as we want just to provide a high level overview. But for some of the more fancy cooperative hybrid cloud arrangements, there is an amount of routing to work. This was actually where we first started with the brokerage concept back at Network Shop in Strathclyde in 2008. This is where the original concept was required. We needed Janet to act as a broker to provide the ability to move between different providers, but provide that networking overlay that Janet's uniquely positioned to provide as all of our organisations connect through that single provider. So that's where the original brokerage concept in terms of the technology came from. So I provided some considerations that we've been looking at. As we've gone through the slides for the last half an hour, I'm just wondering if you've got any of your own views. So you've got two chat pods in front of you. We're after your own views yourself. What other considerations are there that we've missed? So what things on your infrastructure do you think you could possibly use? I mean, if I start you off, feel free to click and type into either of the pods. One of the things that I haven't mentioned is backup. We haven't covered how we're going to back up part of our infrastructure, how that works with the cloud. Are there any resources that you'd like to see developed to the future? We'll give it a couple of minutes if you want to put any suggestions in to these boxes, and then we'll open up for general Q&A in a couple of minutes. I can see a couple of people are typing. Yes, thank you, Bradley. One of the things that I should have mentioned at the beginning is, as part of the series of lunchtime cloud computing sessions, our colleagues in Janet CSIRT are going to be running a session on infrastructure security as well. That's really critical. Mobility of storage, again, that's something that's really useful. Something that we've not looked at in a lot of detail at the moment, as we've only had one provider of our cloud storage. As we look at exit issues for that, as we look at moving forward to having multiple providers, mobility of storage is one thing that we'll have to think quite heavily about. So in terms of working with neighbouring organisations, there's some work in the YHMAN area in terms of that. I think those fit quite well with shared services across the community. Latency, we haven't actually had much of experience with ourselves in terms of it being problematic. We're just starting to look at corporate desktops provided via the cloud. So latency in that particular area is quite sensitive. With some of the new protocols to provide desktop virtualization, it'd be quite interesting to see how latency looks at that areas. There's also some comments coming into the resources chat pod on the right-hand side. I've got colleagues here from the Janet brokerage team and from Janet training who are going to capture some of these so we can make sure that we look at trying to provide them within the community. Looking back at the infrastructure considerations, load testing is quite an interesting one. We've tried a number of tools in terms of load testing. We had some experience back when we ran the Janet Web Cache service with Manchester University in late 99 and early 2000s. So there's a couple of tools that we were using back then, things called Siege, Deluge. But in terms of tools and expertise, that's something that I think that's quite key. I'll let my colleagues from Janet UK capture those particular requirements. Then we'll move on and open towards a general Q&A in a couple of slides. So I provided some considerations that we've been looking at as we've gone through the slides for the last half an hour. I'm just wondering if you've got any of your own views. So you've got two chat pods in front of you. We're after your own views yourself. What other considerations are there that we've missed? So what things on your infrastructure do you think you could possibly use? I mean, if I start you off, feel free to click and type into either of the pods. One of the things that I haven't mentioned is backup. We haven't covered how we're going to back up part of our infrastructure, how that works with the cloud. Are there any resources that you'd like to see developed in the future? We'll give it a couple of minutes if you want to put any suggestions in to these boxes, and then we'll open up for general Q&A in a couple of minutes. I can see a couple of people are typing. Yes, thank you, Bradley. One of the things that I should have mentioned at the beginning is, as part of the series of lunchtime cloud computing sessions, our colleagues in Janet CSIRT are going to be running a session on infrastructure security as well. That's really critical. Mobility of storage, again, that's something that's really useful. Something that we've not looked at in a lot of detail at the moment, as we've only had one provider of our cloud storage. As we look at exit issues for that, as we look at moving forward to having multiple providers, mobility of storage is one thing that we'll have to think quite heavily about. So in terms of working with neighbouring organisations, there's some work in the YHMAN area in terms of that. I think those fit quite well with shared services across the community. Latency, we haven't actually had much of experience with ourselves in terms of it being problematic. We're just starting to look at corporate desktops provided via the cloud. So latency in that particular area is quite sensitive. With some of the new protocols to provide desktop virtualization, it'd be quite interesting to see how latency looks at that areas. There's also some comments coming into the resources chat pod on the right-hand side. I've got colleagues here from the Janet brokerage team and from Janet training who are going to capture some of these so we can make sure that we look at trying to provide them within the community. Looking back at the infrastructure considerations, load testing is quite an interesting one. We've tried a number of tools in terms of load testing. We had some experience back when we ran the Janet webcache service with Manchester University in late 99 and early 2000s. So there's a couple of tools that we were using back then, things called Siege, Deluge. But in terms of tools and expertise, that's something that I think that's quite key. I'll let my colleagues from Janet UK capture those particular requirements. Then we'll move on and open towards a general Q&A in a couple of slides. Just looking in terms of futures, one of the things that we're seeing a lot of requirement for is a research data management in terms of providing a secure infrastructure to win research contracts that meet with a whole raft of security obligations. So one of the things that we're seeing in the future is the Janet brokerage providing a corporate desktop that's provided across the whole of the academic community to make it easier for people who are providing the imaging of applications, who are procuring applications from EduServe Chess, then installing them onto their corporate desktop system. There's already been a discussion about this on the Windows UK JISC list, and there's a lot of interest, particularly in terms of research data management drivers, but we can see a time where we'll have these sorts of shared services provided via that brokerage system across our corporate environment. So that's one of my predictions for the future. Our final poll before we break for Q&A, some more information, is where do you see cloud computing yourself in the future? What's your feel in terms of crystal ball gazing to the sorts of things that you'll see at your organisation? We seem to have some quite polar results. I'll start to open the poll so you can see as people are selecting. A lot of people wanted to look at the end game of embracing that cooperative hybrid cloud technology. Also, a lot of people interested in the development of shared services to provide service within the community. Janet UK themselves being the primary shared services with the community, there's lots of opportunities to bring that into our work. Also, some people looking at the Amazon EC managed cloud infrastructure offerings. A lot of researchers who are computing data have been looking at those areas so far. Okay, thank you very much for those. Just to let you know, we have a new Janet training course being delivered. The first run of this course is going to be just before Net Workshop at the University of York. This particular course covering the implementation of virtualization technology and cloud computing. And the course is pitched really providing you that overarching information for how to architect your infrastructure, also providing you the wealth of resources to get started in those particular areas. So it's not a detailed technical course, but it's a technical overview of architecture required in those two areas. So if you are going to Net Workshop, then feel free to book on that particular course if that's of interest. Or if you're in travelling distance, we've got that running on the first day, and we'll start to announce some more locations across the UK as we go through the year. Also to let you know, there is an entire parallel session dedicated to cloud computing. I believe that's at the last day in the morning at Janet Net Workshop. Some of the considerations that we had right at the very beginning, those clouds around the university about business drivers. We had people like Christine Sexton talking about her experience with the US Patriot Act, information security, concerns with cloud computing there as well. So something for you to watch out for.